Good morning, and a very, very warm welcome. It's not, hopefully not too warm. I'm Michael. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Centre for Social Research, and I'm genuinely delighted to welcome you to the launch of the 42nd British Social Attitude Survey, which is the longest running measure of public opinion in Britain. So genuinely delighted. This is our flagship study. It was based on work that was carried out last autumn, shortly after the Labour government took power after 20 years. We've got a series of presentations for you this morning from our research team, and then we've got some invited guests who are going to give their reflections on the studies and the study's findings. The British Social Attitudes Survey is something that NatCen is incredibly proud to have developed and built up over the years. It's something that partner organisations effectively fund us to take on particular questions. And so if anyone is interested in partnering with us, then please do speak to any member of the NatCen team. We'd love to work with you in continuing to build this survey up because it truly is a really important social asset. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Sarah Rajeswaran, who is one of our trustees. NatCen is governed by 12 trustees who all give of their time, great energy and support to myself and all of the organisation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass straight over to Sarah. Sarah has a fantastic career in both the public, government and private sector. So she's going to be our host for today. So over to you, and thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to host today's proceedings, partly because the BSA really is the reason why I am a trustee of NatCen. In most of my career, I have lent into the amazing work of the BSA to really try and get under the skin of what the British public think, because as we know, there's really no point in making any kind of political decisions if you don't understand what our public thinks. Now, I'm not going to bore you with my views on this because we have 4 fantastic speakers from NatCen and then 2 great respondents. And I'm just going to very quickly introduce them and then invite Sir John to start us off. So our first speaker probably doesn't need an introduction with Professor Sir John Curtis. You will know him from all the amazing work he does in the media and in his own research. But you may not know that he has been a regular contributor to the BSA since 1986, not 1886, 1986, and editor since 1994. So what he doesn't know about British social attitudes, quite frankly, doesn't need to be said. We then have Alex Scholes, who, despite his accent, is a representative from our Scotland office. He is a research director on attitudinal surveys and NatCen's opinion panel. We then have Marta Metsakanitsa. Sorry, Marta, who is a research director also on attitudinal surveys, but also leads NatCen's opinion panel, which is the first mixed mode random probability panel in the UK. We then have Gianfranco Adario, who is from our analysis unit, and he is also really interestingly pursuing a PhD covering, amongst many other things, populism and the backlash against globalization. So very, very interesting work. From our respondents, we're very lucky to have Annalise Dodds, who is the MP for Oxford East since 2017. Annalise has a great career from the shadow and ministerial positions in the Labour Party, but more so for us, we're very glad to have her because she is also a social scientist by background as an academic in comparative public policy. And then we will have Michael Saville from RUSI, who we're so lucky to have on a week like the one we're in, or the couple of weeks like the ones we're in. He is the Director of Military Services at RUSI and an expert on defence policy, military operations and national security policy. So I'm sure we will have lots and lots of questions for him. Now, very sadly, Stephen Bush can't be with us today because he has a family emergency. So if you could all indulge me, I hope you will all have lots of questions for our panel session where we will go through, where you can be able to fill us in on all your questions about politics and what the chapters say about our political standing. So without further ado, Sir John.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As you're saying how long I've been associated with this project, I know sometimes refer to myself as the walking museum with the British Social Attitude Survey. Sometimes we have questionnaire design meetings and somebody says, oh, maybe we should do a question about X. And I kind of scratch my head and say, try the 1987 British Social Attitude Survey. I think we might have vaguely asked a question about that somewhere. But there we go. Anyway, we're going to talk about things much more contemporary today. I'm going to talk first of all about a chapter that really focuses on the state of public opinion so far as the challenges that were facing the UK Labour government elected just a little under a year ago. But let me just first of all, just say a little bit more about the Social Attitude Survey. As Michael's already referred to, it started back in 1983, which actually is the year I first walked in the doors of what was then social and community planning research. Crucial thing to understand about the survey is that it is random probability sampling. It always has been. That is basically, we take addresses off the postcode address register, which is pretty much a complete register of all the addresses in the UK. And we send out letters saying, would you like to do this nice survey? It's really interesting and really exciting. And until the pandemic, it used to be done face-to-face. The pandemic, of course, forced us to change things. It was something we were thinking about anyway. It's now done primarily as what's called a push-to-web survey. That is, we send out lots of letters and say, would you like to answer this survey? But rather than interviewer knocking on their door and doing all of this, it now comes as an email, it comes over the internet, it comes as a letter, and people are being asked to fill in the form online. As you can see, the 2024 survey, which is the results of which we're revealing today, it interviewed just over 4,000 people in September and October of last year. Although actually, as you will hear a little bit about this morning, because of political developments both here and in the United States, we also did a bit of a follow-up survey using the NatSend opinion panel in the spring of this year. If you've got more questions about this, ask in the Q&A. Okay, so we don't necessarily have to endorse the Chancellor's claim that there was a 24 billion pound black hole in the UK finances during the course of the last financial year, the claim she made on coming to office, to accept that the circumstances in which Labour came to power were undoubtedly challenging. It was an era of little economic growth, certainly since the financial crash, and something that was even more clearly the case during the 1999 to 24 Parliament, both because of the pandemic and because of the Russian-Ukraine war and the impact of that on the cost of living. That Parliament was also a Parliament saw record hikes in both taxation and spending. It's the biggest increase in the size of the state since the 1940s. Yet, despite spending a great deal more money, delivery has proven to be more difficult, especially in the case of the health service. Meanwhile, because we borrowed a lot of money in order to save the labour market and to reduce the cost of energy at the worst of the cost of living crisis, we now have a GDP to debt ratio of nearly 100. So borrowing on the markets is now much more constrained. And meanwhile, one of the other legacies of the pandemic is that the proportion of the people of working age who are active in the labour market has declined, particularly amongst those in their 50s and early 60s. So the challenge facing the government has been, how does it return to an era of economic growth and better public services while the fiscal firepower that's available to them is arguably significantly constrained? So what's Labour's answer to this challenge? Well, it has been, first of all, of course, no increase in the rates of taxes that are paid by most people, rates, not necessarily thresholds. And to that extent, at least, some people would argue that Labour ensured that the fiscal constraints it was facing were even tighter than they were already. Meanwhile, to focus public spending more on the NHS, very clearly again articulated in the recent spending review, but that there are otherwise, be outside the NHS, with perhaps now the exception of defence, various degrees of relative restraint. And then how does it get out of the fiscal bind? Well, essentially by pursuing economic growth And in particular there, it has a focus on investing in infrastructure. So I'm going to look to see where do the public stand on some of these stances that Labour have, and taking advantage of the fact that we can not only just tell you where are the public now, but how does where the public are now on these things compare with the timeline, in some cases, back to the 1980s. So first of all, I mean, are Labour right to feel that the economy is a significant challenge, that the health service is a significant challenge? Short answer, yes. Here's a question that we've been asking ever since the financial crash, basically asking people, how do you feel? How do you feel about how you're coping on household income? Are you living comfortably? Are you kind of basically just getting by? Or are you struggling? The purple line are the folk who are comfortable. The green line are those who are struggling. As you can see, the purple line has been following, the green line has been growing. And indeed in 2024, we were even slightly more pessimistic about our income situation than we were in 2023. On the NHS, well, this is something we've been tracking all the way since 1983, whether people are satisfied or dissatisfied with the state of the NHS. As you can see, basically in the wake of the pandemic, if you look at the far right-hand line, the red line is those who are dissatisfied. Most recent reading, we've got 59% of people who are dissatisfied, only 21% who are satisfied. That is a record level of dissatisfaction. We are markedly more dissatisfied now than we were in the 80s and early 90s under the Thatcher and Major regimes. Our satisfaction rose dramatically in the wake of New Labour, and that survived the so-called era of Cameron Osborne austerity, but it did not survive the pandemic. So these are two clearly major problems. But and the truth is also that despite the fact that we're spending so much more on the health service, 69% of people in our sample said the government should be spending more on the health service. So that is clearly a priority for the public. But what about not spending on other things? Well, the health service is not the only public service about which there is considerable discontent. This is attitudes towards social care. And as you can see, basically since the pandemic, satisfaction with social care has been markedly lower. It's never been particularly great in contrast to the health service, and that has not really improved. So we've only got 13% of people who are saying they are satisfied. And of course, this is another subject on which the Labour government made a decision early in its life, one that's caused much less controversy, but it basically was to yet again, not for the first time, to kick the can down the road about changing the funding of social care, and in particular the idea of having a lifetime limit on how much people should have to pay for it. Well, this is what people say when we are asked who should pay for care. Actually, you get about 36%, 37% of people saying the government should just pay full stop and it should be funded much like the NHS. And you've got in a similar number who actually say, yes, we should go for the lifetime cap. And that, if anything, has become more popular over time. The implication, therefore, is that around 2/3 of us would like the government to be doing more to contributing to the cost of social care than it is doing at the moment. So here is one area where the public aren't necessarily looking for cuts, including a cut or at least a postponement that Labour have implemented. Of course, the subject that is currently the subject of very considerable controversy is the government's stance on disability benefits. And this is, in one sense, the good news for the government. This is a question we've asked regularly all the way back since the last 1990s, asking people whether or not should the government be spending more or less on spending on disability benefits for people with disabilities. And as you can see, at 45%, the proportion of people who say we should be spending more has fallen to a record low. However, that still means that only 11% of us think that we should be spending less. And what we also went on to ask in this year's survey was to ask people whether or not they thought it was too easy or too difficult to claim disability benefit. And the answer was that yes, 29% of people think it is too easy, and therefore to some degree echo the concerns that have been articulated by the government, but equally 29% of people think that it is too difficult. And of course, those people who voted Labour are about 2 to 1, about twice as likely to be in the more difficult, too difficult camp than in the too easy camp. So you can see why this still might cause a certain amount of difficulty for a Labour government. Taxation has risen. And one fascinating question is, to what extent have the public rebelled against that? To what extent are they now seeking the so-called tax burden to be reduced, or are they still focused primarily on wanting to improve public services? Well, certainly, so far as those on low and middle incomes are concerned, there has been an increase as compared with the last time we asked it in 2016 in the proportion of people who think that incomes on the taxes on these two groups are too high. And to that extent, at least, we can see something of a reaction against the rise in taxation, although note, attitudes are not that different from what they were back in 2009, when Labour had actually increased taxes, including national insurance. At the same time, however, 44% of people think that those on high incomes are not paying enough, that taxes on them are too low. And that figure is still higher than it was in 2016. You might want to say, yes, we would like somebody else to pay more taxes at least, but we're not at least averse to that. Anyway, this is a question that BSA has been asking again all the way back to 1983. It says to people, if the government has to choose, do you think it should be increasing taxes and spending on health, education, social benefits, keep things as they are, or should they reduce them? Now, typically very few people say reduce, but as you can see, attitudes towards whether or not we should be spending more or keeping things as they are have changed over time. And in fact, what has tended to happen is that when spending has been cut, people have started to react against that. You can see that in the data for the 1990s, when people were much more likely to say to increase rather than reduce. New Labour eventually increased public spending, increased taxes. And after a while, we said, well, thanks very much for improving the health service and improving the schools, but could you now please tax us rather less? That mood of them pertained quite a long way through to the Cameron-Osborne austerity, and pertained for most of the pandemic, despite the very substantial increase in the size of the state. Now, however, in our most recent reading, it is now just 40% of people who say that we should be spending more. And to that extent, at least, we are now seeing some signs of reaction against the expansion of the state. That said, office when the tax burden was still lower than it is at the present. So I think the jury is out to some degree at the moment as to whether or not we have embraced a somewhat bigger state in the light of the experience of the pandemic or not. So finally, pursue growth, get out of the fiscal constraint. Answer, relax the planning laws, make it much more easier to build infrastructure. Well, this is a question we've been asking since 2010, asking people, would you support or oppose more houses being built in your area? And as you can see, for much of the previous decade, we had nearly 60% of people saying, yep, good idea, absolutely, definitely. And then along came the pandemic. And a lot of us discovered that we were living at home rather more than we were used to, and were perhaps noticing what home was like rather more than we were used to. And as you can see, support for building houses in people's own area fell away quite markedly during the pandemic, and it's not really recovered to any significant degree since. So again, we can't necessarily assume here that when push comes to shove and people are presented with proposals to build houses in their area, that it's necessarily going to be greeted with acclaim. We also this year, for the first time, asked some questions about building green infrastructure. Now, one thing which the last government weren't very keen on, which was building wind farms on land, this doesn't seem to, in principle at least, controversial. 70% of people think it should be made easier to build wind farms on land. But when it comes to those electricity pylons that are going to carry that electricity upon which we are all now going to become increasingly reliant, to carry those wires across the countryside, well, yes, we've got more in favour than against, but notice it's less than half that are in favour. And much the same is true of the always controversial issue of building more nuclear power stations. So I think, again, we cannot necessarily assume that the path of planning reform is necessarily going to be any less politically contentious than is the path of potentially increasing taxation. So Labour have definitely got the problem. They've certainly identified the problem correctly. That said, they're still reluctant to accept spending squeezes beyond health, including in the subject of welfare benefits. Voters have perhaps reacted to some degree against the expansion of the state, but the question is, given historical precedent, might we have expected them to do so more? And building infrastructure, well, it sounds like a good idea, but when it's in your own backyard, you may have a different view.
Thank you very much, John. Well, that is quite a bit of food for thought for all of us here, but also for our politicians over in Westminster. Now, going as a partner to that chapter is the chapter we're going to have next, which Alex is going to outline on Britain's democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. So my presentation today is going to cover findings from the health check chapter of the report, where we examine the state of the democracy that Labour inherited. Is it in robust physical health or in need of some urgent medical assistance? So we sought to answer three key questions in this chapter. Firstly, what effect, if any, has the general election had on the nature of party political support in Britain? Secondly, has the general election done anything to help restore trust and confidence in the political system? And thirdly, what were the attitudinal drivers that can help us explain why turnout at this general election dropped to a historic low? So let's look at the nature of party political support first. So what this slide does, it provides a breakdown of those who voted either Conservative or Labour by social class on the left, age in the middle, and then education on the right. Now, the traditional distinction between the middle classes voting Tory and the working classes voting Labour has been steadily disintegrating over time, especially in the wake of Brexit. And after the 2019 election, the Labour Party made a conscious effort to try and re-engage with many pro-Leave, working class, quote-unquote, red wall voters that they lost to the Conservatives. But have they succeeded? Well, this chart shows not really. So as shown here, the 2024 election shows little sign of a return to the traditional distinction between Tories and Labour on this metric. The Tories are about as popular with middle-class voters as they are with working-class ones, while support for Labour remains higher among the middle classes. In fact, Reform is the only party which is most popular with working-class voters. So if social class is no longer the dividing line between the two main parties, age and education certainly are, with Labour much more popular among younger voters and the highly educated, and Tories more popular with older voters and those with fewer educational qualifications. And these demographic differences were evident in the two post-Brexit elections too, 2017 and 2019. Views on Brexit were significantly associated with both age and education, so it's little wonder that they then had a strong impact on voting behaviour at the last election. And what we see is that although Brexit may have dropped down in salience as an issue for voters, these demographic divides are still playing a strong role. And as shown in this slide, Brexit is still a key dividing line when it comes to how people divided to vote. Conservatives still more popular among Leavers than among Remainers. And despite Labour's efforts to maybe re-engage with their Leave support, they're still more popular among Remain voters. And the key beneficiary of the collapse in support among Leavers for the Tories was not Labour, but of course, Reform UK, who were much more popular among Leave voters than they were Remainers. So the 2024 election was not the harbinger of a great deal of change in the character of party political support, but did it do anything to restore trust and confidence in the political system? So what this chart shows is the proportion of people who trust the British governments to put national over party interests just about always or most of the time. A question we've asked on BSA consistently since 1986. So what previous research has shown is that general elections typically help to restore trust and confidence in the political system. You get to hold governments to account. You either keep them in if you like them, you boot them out if you don't like them, and you get your voices heard. So in each of the highlighted general election years, starting in 1987, you can see that sort of little jump in the level of trust and confidence in governments. However, what you also see is a steady decline in this trend over time. And as we get further along to the right of the chart, the impact a general election previously had is no longer seen in the same way, and the 2024 election is no different on that metric. So the level of trust in government remains low, despite the general election delivering a decisive Labour majority. So only 12% of people in our latest survey trust the government just about always or most of the time. And this trend is borne out by other questions in the survey. We ask about the levels of trust in politicians, whether you think the current system of government is working. All of those show a collapse in trust and confidence over time, and 2024 was no different. So what are some of the effects of this decline in trust and confidence? Well, one beneficiary of it at least has been the Reform Party. So this graph compares the share of the vote among Tories, Labour, Reform and Greens among the general population, and among those who almost never trust governments. So as shown, well, only 16% of people said they voted Reform at in the BSA survey. As many as 24% of those who mistrust governments of any stripe did so. Whereas for the other parties, the relationship is not as statistically significant, or in the case of Labour, it's actually in the opposite direction. And this decline in the level of trust and confidence in government is also influencing people's attitudes towards electoral reform. So BSA has asked since 1983, so the start of the survey, whether we should keep the current system of electing our MPs or whether we should change it to allow for a more proportional system. So as shown in this chart, support for keeping the system as it was greater than support for change right up until the 2020s and the pandemic. And since then, support for change has been steadily increasing. And at 60% in our latest survey, it's at the highest level it has ever been. Interestingly, and for the first time, a majority of supporters of each of the main political parties, including the Conservatives, now think we should change the voting system rather than keep it as it is. And of course, those who think the current system of government can be improved and those who are deeply mistrustful of government are more likely to think the electoral system is in need of some change. So this overall level of decline in the level of trust and confidence in government is in turn influencing attitudes towards electoral reform. So why have trust and confidence declined in this way? We explore three potential reasons in this chapter. Firstly, Brexit. So its delivery initially boosted Leavers' trust and confidence in the system, but this trust has now declined. So 85% of Leavers and 81% of Remainers believe the present system of government could be improved a great deal or quite a lot. So that Brexit dividend in terms of trust and confidence among Leave voters has now diminished and is just not apparent. Secondly, widespread dissatisfaction with public services, as was shown in John's presentation. Record numbers of people are dissatisfied with the way the NHS is working, and these people are more likely to lack trust and confidence in the political system. Finally, financial struggles. So a significant proportion of people are struggling on their household income, and this group are also more likely to lack trust in the system. So turning to our final question now. Last year, we saw the second lowest turnout at a general election since 1885. So what might help explain this level of apathy or voter disengagement? Interestingly, what we found in this report is the explanation for this does not primarily lie, as we might expect, in declining levels of trust and confidence in the system, but actually with other factors, such as people's perceptions of duty to vote. So in our latest survey, only 2/3 of people say it's everyone's duty to vote, whereas 3/4 did so back in 2020. And at the same time, there was an increase in the proportion who feel you should only vote if you care who actually wins. And what this chart does is it shows the level of turnout by how people feel about voting in the wake of the 2019 and 2024 elections. So as you can see, there's not much difference in the level of turnout among the people who think it's everyone's duty to vote and those on the other end of the spectrum who think it's not really worth voting at all. Where there is a significant change is among that group of people who feel you should only vote if you care who actually wins the outcome of the election. It was this group, who obviously did not care at this election, who stayed at home and helped to drive the turnout to one of the lowest we've seen for a very long while. Finally, the drop in turnout was also affected by both levels of interest in politics and party identification. So on the left of this chart, you can see that almost all of those who said they had a great deal of interest in politics voted at the election, both in the wake of the 2019 election and in the wake of the 2024 election. However, there was a significant drop among those who say they have no interest in politics at all. So 44% of those voted in the wake of the 2019 election, but that's dropped to 28% in our latest survey. So those who typically have no interest in politics and don't really follow it were just not motivated to go to the polls this time in a way that they were in 2019. Finally, on the right, you can see figures broken down by party identification. So as might be expected, supporters of, or those who feel closer to one of the political parties are more likely to vote in a general election than those who don't feel that way. Unlike with interest in politics, the decline in turnout among both groups is more or less the same. However, there are now more people who do not identify with a party than there were in 2019. So 4 in 10 people now say they do not feel closer to any of the political parties, and that's up from 29% in the 2019 election. So there are more of us now without a party political identification. They're more likely to stay at home, and that also helped to drive the lower turnout. So to summarize, the drop in turnout is primarily a story to do with a weakening of the extent to which the current party system and the system of government can attract the attention or loyalty of people who are not so engaged as others. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. Again, a lot to think about. I think that sense of apathy amongst the population is quite a striking thing, and it's so interesting to see it borne out in the numbers and in the last couple of elections that we've had and what have been those drivers. And I think the next presentation from Marta will help go into a bit more detail in that with the impact of politics and social media.
So my presentation today focuses on findings from the politics and social media chapter, where we examine the level of trust, engagement, the levels of engagement, trust, and political polarization in the digital age. So social media have transformed how people engage with politics in Britain, but what does this mean for democracy? Do social media foster informed debate and civic participation, or do they deepen division and distrust? The literature offers mixed perspectives on this critical issue. So to explore this issue, we ask respondents where they primarily get their political news. Looking at all UK adults aged 16 and over, the most cited primary source of political news is television, which is mentioned by around 3 in 10, 31%. However, television is only just ahead of social media, which is the primary source for as many as 27% UK adults. The 3 other sources that we investigated, website, newspaper, radio, and podcast, are less popular. So social media are nowadays evidently a key medium through which UK adults acquire information about what is going on in politics. For the rest of the presentation, we'll compare 2 groups: those who obtain most of their news about politics from social media, also referred to as social media users, and those who mainly rely on other media. With these 2 groups in mind, we'll look at 3 key aspects of the debate about the relationship between social media use and politics in the UK. So first, we examine who those who mainly use social media are. What's their demographic profile? Second, we assess perceptions of reliability and openness to diversity. So to what extent do social media users find political content reliable? And how open are they to encountering diverse viewpoints? Finally, we consider the broader political implications. Are social media users more or less politically engaged? Are their views more or less polarized? and how much trust do they place in political institutions? So let's begin by looking at the demographic profile. Perhaps unsurprisingly, being young is by far the most distinctive characteristic at the moment. So a striking 60% of social media users are under 35, while just 12% are over 55. In contrast, more than half, 52% of users of other media are age over 55. But age is not the only characteristic that makes this group distinct. Even when controlling for age, we found that other demographics made them stand out. First, looking at educational level, social media users are more likely to be less educated. 30% have a qualification below A level, while the same figure for other media users is 35%. When looking at occupation, which is a proxy for social class, social media users are more likely to be in semi-routine or routine occupation, 25% versus 11% of other media users. Social media users are also more likely to be from an ethnic minority background, 24% versus 9%. And finally, looking at the use they do of the internet, they are more likely to be always switched on, that is to use the internet almost all of the time throughout the day, 58% versus 36% of other media users. And they are also more likely to agree with the statement that they would feel lonely without the internet, 34% versus 17%. So now that we understand who social media users are and who other media users are, the question is, do they trust what they see, what they hear, what they read on the medium that they primarily use to get news of what's going on in politics? So to answer these questions, we look at the perceived reliability of each media. On this slide, for each media source, we show the proportion of users who consider their chosen media to be reliable, the green bars, or unreliable, the orange bars. Only 53% of social media users perceive their main source, so social media platforms, as reliable. This is much lower than all other media types users. By contrast, the proportion who trust their main source rises to 71% for website users, 76% for television, and up to 83% for both newspapers and radio and podcasts. So these data suggest that many social media users may be aware of the social media platform's limitations. But does this awareness lead them to seek a broader range of views? Our data suggests it does, because social media users are also more likely to cross-check information across different platforms, and this may potentially expose them to more diverse political environment. So to explore this aspect further and this hypothesis further, we examine how often users encounter views that are similar or different to their own. These charts show whether the contact with people with the same views on the left-hand side of the slide and with different views on the right-hand side has increased, remained the same, or decreased in the past 12 months. Let's focus on the chart on the right. So people with different views. So among social media users, 21% state that their contact with people with different views has decreased, while only 9% indicated it has increased. By contrast, among those who rely on other media, the proportions are more balanced, with 8% reporting a decrease and 6% an increase. However, when looking at this type of contacts and these movements up and down, increase and decrease combined, we found that only 4% of social media users say the contact with people with the same views increase, while the contact with the people with different views decrease. So this means that just a minority of social media users indicate that their online contact has become consistently less diverse over time. So our data indicates that social media users are not living in bubbles of like-minded individuals. We also found only little or no evidence that their attitudes are more polarized. However, we did find some indication of polarization across the libertarian and authoritarian divide, a divide which may affect position on what are more likely to be regarded as moral choices, a matter of what is right, what is wrong. For example, views on rights of transgender people. This polarization across this divide is reflected in other two aspects, which are the last two aspects we'll look at today. The first one is a greater propensity to vote for non-mainstream parties who sit at the ends of this spectrum. And second, a greater distrust in political institutions. So let's have a look at this. Starting with party support. Overall, social media users are more likely to be uninterested in politics in general and take part less in formal political activities, such as signing up to a party or organizing a protest. So they are overall more disengaged. However, when they take part in formal politics activities like general elections, they show notably different voting preferences compared to users of other media. Looking at the party they voted at the 2024 general election, 12% of social media users backed the Greens and 20% supported reform. This is respectively 6 percentage points higher and 5 percentage points higher among the support found among other media users. So in total, around 1 in 3, 32% of social media users backed either the Greens or reform. This figure is significantly higher than the combined 21% vote share these two parties received nationally when looking at the election results. Finally, looking at public trust in institutions, such as the courts and parliament, respondents were asked to rate their trust on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 means no trust at all and 10 means complete trust. Overall, this trust, the orange bars on the chart, is higher among social media users for both institutions. You can also look at the average trust score in bold beneath each chart, and it is lower for social media users, 5.3 versus 6.2 for courts and 3.9 versus 4.4 for parliament. So a hypothesis is that reliance on social media may have played some role in generating greater distrust. So to conclude, due to natural generational shifts, social media appears set to become the most popular way for asserting political development and news in the future. And what does this mean for the relationship between social media use and democracy and politics in the UK? Our findings reveal a complex relationship which is marked by both disengagement and polarization in voting behaviors. So on one side, social media users are less engaged with formal politics and less interested in politics overall. They are generally exposed to diverse viewpoints, so we didn't find any evidence of echo chambers. They are not very much polarized, and we didn't find any evidence that they are polarized when looking at general attitudes. On the other side, we did find indication they are more polarized on the libertarian-authoritarian divide, which in turn may impact their greater propensity to vote for non-mainstream parties, which are at the end of this divide, Greens and Reform, and have greater distrust of political institutions. Within this picture, it is crucial to us when and under what conditions these dynamics might shape social and political attitudes and might make a difference for all of us.
Thank you so much, Marta. And I think this chapter, Master's chapter, is such a great example of what Nat Sen does best. You know, the first two chapters are so fascinating in understanding the temperature of the British public at the moment in regards to some of the most important political questions in front of us. But Marta's chapter really goes underneath that to try and understand in that really key demographic, in the demographic that all political parties and all public sector organizations and private sector organizations want to speak to, how they are getting their information, what is driving them to that information, and what are the key differentiators between those people and the rest of the population. So I would really encourage anyone interested in how the public think today to really dive into that chapter and maybe wrestle with some of the questions that are posed there. But now onto something that is, I was going to say completely different, but it's not really completely different. It's slightly different, but it's absolutely timely. Gianfranco's chapter on security threats and military spending.
Thank you very much. So, in 2024, we were going through obviously a fairly tense international scenario, and we were asking ourselves three key questions. So the first one is, what are the attitudes of the British public on military and defense spending? The second one is, which are the countries that the British public consider to be threats to global peace? And the last question was, how have these attitudes changes over the past few decades? So to answer these questions, we included some questions into the British social attitudes study. Now, BSA since 1983 has always included fairly regularly a question they ask which one should be the highest priority for extra government spending. Now, there have been always 10 items included. Defense is one of them. Others are, for example, education, healthcare, or international aid. So there is a number of different items. Now, as we can see, we for across the 90s, we always had these numbers averaging around 1%. So the trend series started in 1983, just at the end of the Falkland War. And then throughout the 90s, we had pretty much everything 1% until 2003. So in 2003, we see the war in Iraq. And the number essentially starts increasing until reaching 6% around 2009. After that, we see there is a slow decline, especially during COVID. So during COVID, these figures drop again. And then we didn't have data in 2021 and 2023. So we don't know exactly what the British public thought in those years, but we had the figure again in 2024, and we saw an increase up to 9%. So this one is the highest number ever recorded on British social attitudes on people that would say defense should be the highest priority for government spending. The study also included another question, which is essentially asking directly study participants whether they believe the government should spend more or less on military and defense. Now, this question was fielded in the study a little bit less regularly, so you can see that we have a few gaps in the chart. But broadly speaking, we can see that across the 90s, people were much more likely to say that the government should spend less in defense and military. In around 2006, we see the figures essentially getting very close. And then from 2016 onwards, we can see that those trends have stabilized with 40% of adults believing the government should spend more or much more in defense, and about 20% should spend less or much less. In the study, we also included a series of questions asking study participants which countries they believe to be a serious threat to war peace in the next 10 years. Now, this question in BSA was asked 3 times, in 1994, in 2005 and 2024. In 1994 and 2005, there were military engagement in Iraq. So essentially, we're talking about the Gulf War and then Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2005. In both years, the country that was the most, considered the most as a threat, perceived the most as a threat, was Iraq, not included in these charts. But for your reference, in 1994, Iraq was at 70%, and in 2005, around 50%. Now, if we look at the figures today, we see so if we look at 2024, we see that Russia was by far considered the most serious threat to world peace at 90%. The other countries were around 70%. So whether it's China, Iran, or Israel, around 70%, and the US at 36%. This data was collected during the election in the US, so we wanted to ask the question again in April, essentially 3 months after the election of Donald Trump. We found no differences for Russia, Israel, Iran, and China, but we found the number on the US jumping from 36% to 72%. So 72% of the British public today consider the US as a serious threat to world peace. We also have differences by party identification, as we would expect. So in terms of defense being the highest priority for government spending, we can see that it's an attitude that was primarily expressed by conservative and Reform UK voters. And we can see the same in the following slide, looking at whether military spending should increase or decrease. Now, in both cases, we see Conservative and Reform UK being more likely to say, supporter of the Conservative and Reform UK party, more likely to say the defense should increase, military spending should increase. Supporters of the Green Party being more likely to say that it should decrease. The most interesting point is probably the Labour Party. Supporters of the Labour Party indeed are equally likely to say they should increase and should decrease. So in the last 2 slides, I also want to show you essentially how the perception of the different countries as security threats have changed, varies by party identification. So we have 3 elements that are quite interesting here. So let's start with Russia. This one is 2024 data, and we can see there is a pretty consistent view across the supporter of all the political parties of Russia as a security threat. So we were expecting to see Reform UK having a more positive overview of Russia, but this is not the case. So we see that all the parties average around 90%. We also see the Conservative and Reform UK party tend to converge on their views on their views of security threats. Essentially, both China and Iran seem to be more likely to be seen and perceived as security threats, while Labour Party and Green seem to be more likely to perceive the US as a security threat in 2024. If we jump to 2025, this one essentially is, let's call it the Trump effect. So this one is what we had in the first 3 months, after the first 3 months of election in power for Donald Trump. We can see that across Conservative, Labour, and Green Party, there is an increase of 40 percentage points in the perception of the US as a security threat. There is a very strong increase also for Lib Dem supporters. There is around 30%. And I would say the smallest increase we see is for Reform UK supporters. So they start for a very similar 2024 level in terms of how likely they were to perceive the US as a security threat. But within a few months, essentially, we see a divergence between Conservative and Reform UK, which is, I think, very interesting. Across all the study, we always found Conservative and Reform UK having a substantial convergence in their views on security threats and military spending. And this one is the only aspect where we see them moving in different directions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gianfranco. I think that last slide gives a lot of pause for thought. Before we go on to our Q&A, and I'm sure you've got lots and lots of questions, we have two fantastic respondents. And I've spent most of my career advising politicians for panels just like today. So I give great thanks to Annalise and to her team for being willing to talk about the presentation we have today, because I think every single slide has posed questions for today's policymakers.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here. It's been absolutely fascinating to see the presentations, but also to have had advanced sight of some of the chapters. So I will draw a little bit on that in my comments, which are going to be in kind of three parts. If I may, please do tell me to speed up, by the way, if I'm going on for too long, as politicians sometimes do. So I was going to reflect a bit on some of the differences and similarities indeed between what's presented here around public opinion and some of what I would say is kind of received political discourse, first of all. Secondly, I thought there were some really interesting insights in the work, specifically on social media, but also perhaps some unanswered questions that I'm going to pose. And then finally, I'm afraid, John, I'm going to poke at some questions which I didn't see investigated, but which perhaps have been in the museum of previous versions of the BSA, or maybe not. I mean, we really are incredibly lucky, I think, in the UK that we've got this series running for 42 years. And certainly I've drawn on it as a politician, both in opposition and then in government, as I was previously, and now as a backbencher. First of all, as I said, I think there's some really interesting material in here about some of the perhaps received political wisdom and how that relates to public opinion. John already commented on the analysis around social security spend. Actually, I think the perception of a problem, but the lack of a clear solution probably is shared actually across politicians and the population. I thought the material around the international context was absolutely fascinating. I'm not particularly surprised to see that change in assessment when it comes to kind of transatlantic issues. Obviously, the second survey will have been taking place after the Munich Security Conference, which is when I saw a particularly big shift in kind of political opinion and of specialists involved in security. One thing that I thought was interesting that wasn't referred to in the presentation was that in the initial analysis, I understand there was a very interesting finding that those who are more likely to be concerned about the US's role globally were less likely to support additional defence spending. I wonder whether that is still the case, given that much bigger cohort now. It may be pushing in a different direction. I thought the analysis of views about government intervention in the economy is very interesting. Most of the analysis presented here is obviously about fiscal policy, as John was talking about, but then also about, I believe it's government action to support industry. I think here it's very interesting that we've seen a huge shift in political discourse, but actually looking at the BSA's analysis over the years, there hasn't been a huge shift really in public opinion. Public opinion has consistently been a lot more in favour of government action to support industry than we've seen arguably up until quite recent years, certainly the pandemic period. And then finally, when it comes to public opinion and political discourse, I thought that material about electoral systems and people's views of the need to change was very interesting indeed. And the fact there was first that switch over. What I would now be interested in is perceptions of salience and whether the public want their politicians to be focused on those kinds of issues or whether they want them to be focused on living standards. You know, I think it would be quite interesting actually to find out. Obviously, Parliament has been working very hard on issues like assisted dying, for example. It's consumed a huge amount of political effort, rightly so, of course, because it's such an enormous and important, literally life or death issue. But I'd be quite interested in understanding where the public are in terms of that focus of Parliament on those matters. Secondly, as I said, I thought the material on political attitudes and social media usage was absolutely fascinating. And thank you, Marta, for your presentation. I suppose one thing that I would be quite interested in is how we can relate the material here about people's trust in their ability to particularly spot politically biased material, how we can relate that view to some of the qualitative evidence that's emerging around this, particularly with young people. It's found that, for example, analyses of kind of 16 to 18-year-olds in school and college, that they generally believe that they are quite good at spotting, particularly disinformation and politically biased material. But when they're in kind of experimental conditions, actually it can be quite difficult for them to understand what is verified and to go into that process. So I think, it would be quite interesting to marry up the two in that regard. And one issue that I did want to probe on, it is around sex differences. And I don't know whether the team investigated that or not. The data on social media use and political viewpoint is cut, as I understand it, by social class, by educational level, which I think is really, really interesting to see that. But it doesn't seem to be cut by sex. I mean, there was a bit in the report on greater social or a slightly higher level for young women in relying on social media. I think 55% compared to young men. But I would be quite interested in that because actually, and it kind of relates to the relationship with political opinion, we did see quite big sex differences at the last general election, certainly for smaller parties and amongst young people. So women aged 18 to 24 support Greens more, 23% compared to 12% of young men. Men of that age group are considerably more likely to have voted Conservatives and Reform UK, 10% to 12% respectively, compared to 6% of young women for both of those parties. And of course, that's a trend that we're seeing to a much more marked extent, actually, in some other countries. So the German election results, far more support for the AfD and FDP amongst young men, double the amount, far more support for Die Linke amongst young women. So I think it would be really interesting to look into this. My hunch may be wrong, but I suppose what I would be interested in is how differentiated is that social media content and then how it relates to political opinions and trustworthiness and so forth. I suspect it may well be the case that the content is quite different. And then finally, on some of those additional areas that I think would be interesting to look at, I realise one of the strengths of the BSA is, of course, the fact that it's a series, so I wouldn't want to disrupt that. But when it comes to government intervention, one question that I think is quite interesting now with the new economy, where we see increasingly, particularly in information technology, a development of value that rests on ubiquity, that rests on, kind of monopolistic conditions or quasi-monopolistic conditions. What are attitudes towards competition now in the UK? How does that differ? I think that would be fascinating to understand. And then secondly, digging a bit more, I suppose, into the legacy of Brexit and whether we're seeing correlation here rather than causation. I don't know. I felt they were kind of jumping a little bit between the two sometimes. Is there a linkage when it comes to views related to migration in particular, if we were to parse that out when it comes to political views? But secondly, when social conservatism is mentioned, what are the components of that? I mean, obviously, I should have looked into the annexes to find that out. But how does that relate to political opinion in our, diverse society, where we have, I think now it's around 18% of voters, either themselves are migrants or their families have a migrant background? What does social conservatism mean there? Previously, it might have been assessed as relating to views towards ethnic and racial diversity. Is it instead now more relating to views about, for example, sexuality, about women's roles in the economy, in the home, and so on and so forth? So I think it'd be really interesting to look into that. But I can say that because I don't have to do the work, because I'm just a politician. But really fascinating material. Thank you very much indeed for enabling me to comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalise. And I'd forgotten to mention at the beginning that, as is ever the way with politicians, Annalise has another engagement in about 10 minutes' time. So she will be leaving us shortly. But I'm really grateful that you've posed so many really fascinating questions, which I'll make sure we pick up in the Q&A afterwards. And now moving on to our second respondent. Oh gosh, Matthew. Oh, what a fantastic chair. I've just forgotten his name. Matthew from RISI.
No problem. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the enormous privilege of coming along to speak today. I've now set a timer. Well, I'm actually trying to stick to time because I have a habit of slightly going over. So I'll be fairly brief because actually I do want to get to the questions bit, which is actually the bit that interests me a lot. I should add a couple of caveats in first. Obviously, I'm speaking essentially in a personal capacity, so there is no institutional RISI view on stuff, but just to be absolutely crystal clear, I'm not setting out a sort of an institutional position here. It does mean I will be largely a single issue fanatic, which is mostly to cover the national security and defence deductions, although if we get into the Q&A, you might discover me getting a bit more of my personal views and like a now middle-aged person, I guess, being confused about people who get their news from social media, because I still don't actually know what that means. I think the first thing I should open with in terms of looking at this is it feels like incredibly apposite timing, given that not only have we had the strategic defence review recently, but we've also got a national security strategy that's been published in the past 24 hours. And that will be accompanied, has been accompanied by a kind of an enormous media blitz. And in looking at how the government presents these issues, and then looking at some of the statistics and analysis in the report, you begin to get an understanding of why they act in the way that they do. I should say that I was a civil servant for 20 years, overwhelmingly in national security jobs in the MOD and in the Cabinet Office. And a great part of my time was contributing to lines to take or media briefings and being slightly baffled, and that's a euphemism for deeply frustrated with how presentation affected how we talked about the business of what we do. Even though I understand there is this thing called strategic communications, and that ultimately what you're trying to do with the military and national security is influence the way that people think. And so having something of a window into at least what they think is incredibly useful. Some of my analysis would be to draw upon this and ask, actually, the additional digging that needs to be done is, why do people think the way that they do? And what can we actually say about what is in here and what that means for influencing policy? I think the thing that jumped out at me up front, and it was highlighted in the presentation, is the extent to which the US is regarded as what was described as a security threat. And the figure that was a third of people before the election of Donald Trump, and then that doubled overnight, is frankly quite startling if you are kind of part of the conventional mainstream opinion and believe, as the national security strategy has just said, that the US is fundamentally our core security partner, our closest defense partner, and fundamental to European security across the board. I think it's particularly alarming that it has now jumped to, essentially, never damn it, 3/4. Looking across the board at the rest of the ones, the rest of the countries highlighted, though, there are some equally significant figures. I mean, you'd probably say it's kind of reasonably comforting to see that people, broadly speaking, do agree that Russia is a security threat, given that it's responsible for triggering the largest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And therefore, some suggestions of kind of Russian fifth columnists are perhaps overblown. But if you were looking at these statistics and you're in Tel Aviv right now, you'd be somewhat concerned that it looks like across the board, a majority of people regard Israel, also a close security partner for the UK, as a security threat. And that is before the events of the last 13 days. Now, there is a question, how much of this is conflating personality with state? So there's obviously a Trump effect when it comes to the US. Is there a Netanyahu effect when it comes to to Israel? But equally, you would look at the fairly significant variations in perceptions of threat from China. Although, to be fair, that is reflected in the, if you would like, the ambivalence with which the government actually talks about China. We saw that yesterday in the announcement of the effects of the China audit, as it was called, which sort of I think some people would say still tries to have our cake and eat it. There is obviously, and I'm dabbling with political analysis here, some fairly obvious deductions to be drawn about how split Labour supporters are in terms of defence spending, which is not necessarily surprising, but it does give us some context for the challenge that is currently going on in the debate around increases to UK defence spending and at what rate they should take place, and the fact that actually, therefore, the government is, to some degree, pushing ahead in the face of opposition for within probably its core vote. Of course, that is a tension that is only likely to get worse after the announcement at the NATO summit this week that we will in fact be spending even more than the commitment they made only a couple of months ago. I think some of the statistics in here challenge what we might regard as some of our conventional views on defence, in that it's sort of an accepted norm to say defence is kind of, dropped off in importance and it's not as important as it was in the Cold War when we really knew what we were doing. And yet the figures in there about whether or not defence should be the priority for spending appear to have completely flipped that in terms of being very low during the 80s and then increasing steadily since the 1990s, although I imagine the analysis might say, yes, that's because people thought we were spending enough at the height of the Cold War. But that prioritisation bears some reflection. And it's not exactly stellar now, of course, in terms of actually should this be a priority or not, when compared to almost literally anything else. I think my closing thought would be, I would be interested in questions that actually ask, how much do you understand about defence and national security? When we're talking about the appropriate use of the armed forces, what do you think is an appropriate use of the armed forces? Do you think, what are your position on nuclear weapons, given the government has just announced a potential expansion of the UK's nuclear capabilities? And things like, well, we're worrying about Donald Trump's views on NATO Article 5 and whether the UK would come, whether the US would come to the aid of various countries in Europe. Be interesting to test public opinion on, do you think the UK should come to the aid of other countries in Europe and under what circumstances? Maybe governments don't like asking those questions because they wouldn't be very comfortable with the answers. But anyway, that's some of the stuff we could discuss in questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Now, I'd like to ask all the panelists to come up onto the stage with thanks to Annalise, who we know has to go on now. And we've got roughly about 40 minutes to go over some questions, but I'm going to take the chair's prerogative right now and ask some of the questions that have come up from our respondents. So, Marta, I'm going to go to you first. There are two questions, one that came from Annalise and one that came from Matthew about our social media analysis. So is the data cut by sex? And if not, can it be in future? And what does it show us if it is already? And then Matthew's very, very good question, which is a question that I've perhaps asked myself but never sought to get the answer. What does it mean when we say people who get their news from social media?
Okay, I'll start from the last question. So we ask people where they primarily get their news about politics from. So social media included platforms like WhatsApp, Twitter, X now, but also YouTube. So all of those platforms. We didn't differentiate, or in the survey, we didn't go into the details of whether they get a link from someone and then they follow on and go to the website of the newspaper where the news come from. So it is where they go first when they want to learn about what's going on in politics. Then they might go on and follow up with other sources, but that's their primary source where they get the most of what they know about what's going on. Does this answer?
Thank you. Thank you.
On the cut about by sex, yes, we did look at that, and it is presented in the chapter. I didn't present it here because the difference we found is not significant. So we did find that women or women are less slightly more likely to be on to use social media, but that difference is not significant. However, I would say, connecting to my closing thought, when I said that what we should really keep in mind is that the picture is nuanced. So lots has been said about concerns about echo chambers or people living in these bubbles of like-minded individuals, and our data didn't find strong evidence on that. So when we look at the overall UK adults, we find this pattern with sex, but it might be that if you then break down and look at different breaks of the population, like if you then look at those who also think that they would feel lonely without the internet, and you look at different cross breaks, you might find that sex might play a difference. So in general, I think the message is that it is important to look at variation and make sure that we don't just stop at the headlines or, okay, social media are bad and this is what it means for the whole of the population, but let's see how it varies and how it might differ and what does it mean for different aspects of democracy and politics.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that whole point of being able to look beneath the headlines and to understand the drivers of public perception is really the be-all and end-all of the BSA. On that theme, this is a question for maybe Gianfranco and also for Sir John from Matthew. I think Marta's chapter is a great example of where we can delve deeper into a specific issue through the BSA. And your chapter, Gianfranco, is a great example of being able to be nimble and ask questions that perhaps we haven't asked before. So would we be able to, in future BSAs, delve deeper into what the public actually understand about defence and security policy and where they might want the government to go on particular issues surrounding defence?
Thank you for the question. So I think with the chapter that we published this year in this annual report, we probably just scratched the surface of the topic. So there is much more that can be done to understand through the British social attitude study, what is the real understanding, what are the specific attitudes of the British public on these topics. Most of the points that were mentioned by Matthew definitely might require additional exploration. So, for example, what generates this perception of threats? What are the specific elements? Is just a politician telling you China's bad, or there is something else going on? Again, what people understand about the use of military force. So there is much more that probably we need to investigate in the future, especially with the deteriorating international scenario, I'll say.
Absolutely. John?
I'll pick this up, Matthew. It's actually worth remembering that British social attitude started in 1983 when we were arguing about the location of American cruise missiles on UK soil, and there were a lot of protests about that. So actually, back in the 1980s, there was quite a lot on BSA in this area. And actually, so basically what's happened more recently is that, one of the things we try to do on British social attitudes is to generate enough income to fund the survey that we can therefore add questions that we can do. And that's essentially what you've heard about, we said about defence, is essentially us taking the initiative. And we really started picking up in 2021 on this subject. So we have been, as it were, aware that this subject was returning to the forefront of public debate in a way that's not really been true since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in fact, actually, 2021 or 2022, we did ask about nuclear weapons. We've asked about it on a few occasions. I mean, it's one of those issues in which you find the public are pretty evenly divided, okay? But I'll try, if you send me an email, I'll send you the data. Otherwise, what I'm going to say to you, Matthew, of course, is if RUSI would like to collaborate with the National Centre in trying to raise some money so that we can indeed do an in-depth, much more in-depth study on attitudes towards defence and military spending, I am sure we would be, the door would be fully open.
I would be delighted if a generous and benefactor would step forward to support vital research in this area.
Well, indeed, as a trustee, I'll say to everyone in the room or online, if you do want to know more about either defence or security or the two other areas that Annalise mentioned, attitudes towards competition or attitudes towards Brexit and whether some of the policy decisions today are tails wagging dogs, then please do put some money towards the next British Social Attitudes Survey. We are entirely dependent on our funders to do our great work. Before I open up to the audience, I've got one more question, this time to my brain is so awful. This time to Alex. I want to call you Paul Scholes because of the football.
All right,
I apologise. It's a really, really bad word association in my brain. We talked a little bit earlier about how surprising it was that, you know, the referendum on AV was only, what, 14 years ago? And it feels very much like the figures have swung the other way in terms of the public supporting, or the amount of the public that supports an alternative vote system or a change to our voting system, and those that are more in favour of coalition governments. Is there anything in the data that suggests that changing, well, if you change one, it begets the other, really, would increase trust in politics or people's satisfaction, or is that sort of here to stay?
I mean, there's certainly an association, as I outlined in the presentation, between the declining levels of trust and confidence in the political system and appetite for electoral reform. Whether electoral reform would help to reverse that decline in trust and confidence in the political system in isolation is a bit of an open question. And I think you mentioned the AV referendum there. What we ask about in the BSA is whether you would wish to change the current system we have for electoral for electing MPs to the House of Commons to a more proportional one, or to keep the current system as it is. We don't actually specify a form, an alternative form of electing MPs. So whether there would be, there's certainly an appetite for change, but I think the devil is in the detail, and as to the form of that change, how it would come, whether it would be an AV or, you know, an STV or something like that, and then the impact that that specific change would then have on trust and confidence would remain to be seen.
Can I come in on this? So the first thing to say is that there tends to be a relationship between low levels of trust and wanting to change aspects of the political system. That's been evident for some time. The one change for which that is not true, though alas we've not been able to pursue the subject more recently, but when it was last pursued, is actually the change that the current government is trying to pursue, which is the introduction of directly elected mayors. Directly elected mayors is the one constitutional change that we've talked about, you know, in the last 20 years that is not correlated, support for that is not correlated with low levels of trust. Probably because putting more power in the hands of individual politicians is not necessarily something that appeals to people who have low levels of trust. I mean, more broadly, and partly this is kind of responding to Annalise Dodd's comments, well, do you want Parliament to focus on this? I mean, clearly, the figures we've got are in part the product of two things. One is, as was the position for inside the Labour Party in the run-up to 1997, a declining confidence that the party will be able to win under the current system. Okay, we saw that happen inside the Labour Party in the 1990s. The same thing happened in the last Parliament. The Labour Party actually voted in favour of changing the system in 2022, and their supporters fallen behind that. Of course, what then happened in 2024 was the most disproportional outcome ever, including an outcome in which the party, which has traditionally been associated with defending the system bubble, i.e. the Conservatives, particularly lost out from the system. What in a sense is interesting about our data is that the Conservative voters very quickly said, hang on, we're not quite sure this system is such a good idea after all. But it's also that actually Labour and Liberal Democrat supporters, because Liberal Democrats now find themselves in the unusual position of the system not being particularly tough on them, actually haven't changed their minds very much in the other direction. So that's why we've got the figures we've got. I mean, my guess is that probably well, with a caveat, which I'll come to, I suspect during the course of this Parliament, Labour supporters might lose their enthusiasm. That said, and this is why this question matters, this is my response to Annalise Dodds. At the moment, indeed, there is an opinion poll out this morning that says that if we had a general election tomorrow, Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister with 377 seats on 30% of the vote. That is what the current electoral system would do if support for reform remains at its current level and the support for the other parties remain fragmented. Whereas under proportional representation, there would be no chance of reform having an overall majority. So the political scientists to me with this will say to you, electoral systems really matter, because actually electoral systems can fundamentally affect the outcome of elections. And to that, I mean, I think it will be interesting to see whether or not, if reform do remain high in the opinion polls, whether or not those Labour MPs, some Labour MPs did say to me after the last election, you know, the great thing about the current system is it kept reform out. Well, the voters of Kent and of Durham can now tell you it doesn't necessarily work that way.
Thank you so much, John. And that is not only the reason why the electoral system matters, but also the reason why data matters. And on that basis, I'd like to open up questions to the floor. Please just pop your hand up. We'll get a mic to you and we'll get your answer. Does anyone have a question? Fantastic. Can we go to the gentleman at the back?
Thank you very much. I'm Jan Eichhorn, University of Edinburgh. I was wondering, the presentation suggests that people clearly have a desire for spending in certain areas, but at the same time have become a bit more reluctant about the general tax and spend proposition. So what I'm wondering is, should Labour and actually the Conservatives be really worried about other parties that were shown to be getting support amongst younger people and so on, such as Reform suggesting alternative forms of funding that are not borrowing or perceived as tax raising? So things like interest rate rules for the Bank of England to the financial sector, or amongst the green movements, things like money creation, quantitative easing and mechanisms and so on that go into the real economy. Basically, if other parties say to the public, we can raise money without raising taxes or borrowing, is that something that, yeah, Labour and the Conservatives should be worried about?
John, do you want to take that?
Well, partly my short answer to is that's precisely what the Labour Party have done by changing the rules on borrowing, so that at least while the current government is trying to aim for balancing the current expenditure against current revenues by 2029, 2030, it's on capital spending, it's now introduced rules that enable it to borrow more. I mean, beyond that, Jan, I mean, I think I would say that asking the public about quantitative easing, or even about, you know, how you use interest rates to manage the financial system, one of the things that we're very conscious on British social activities is we have to ask questions that people are able to understand. And, you know, I'm not denying the importance of, I mean, quantitative easing is clearly something that's been absolutely fundamental to the way in which we have managed the capitalist system since the financial crash, as indeed the fact that the state now we know now the state underpins the banking system, has now done so repeatedly since 2010. And we can certainly ask questions about banks and how much trust you have in banks. But I think beyond that, getting into the technicalities of the financial system is probably a wee bit more difficult. But I mean, you know, at the end of the day, if you can say to people, you can have jam today and you don't have to pay for it, it will tend to be popular.
Yes, that's one of the underlying benefits, but also challenges of the BSAs, that where, you know, other surveys might look at what you might call informed publics, you know, those with university degrees who get their newspaper, well, their sources from the mainstream media and might understand something like quantitative easing, not necessarily, but might, by really delving into the diversity of the actual British population. You are limited in how you can pose questions and what questions you can pose, given what people understand.
Yes, and I think again comes to some points that Matthew's raised. I mean, I think one of the things to realise is that, in a sense, we take the view that it's important for us as a society to know what people think. We might then want to raise questions about the foundations, about what they think, but unless we understand what people think for whatever reason, on the basis of whatever information, then we are at risk of not appreciating the state where public opinion is at. That doesn't mean to say public opinion isn't capable of being changed, etc., etc. But if you don't know where the public are at, you are always going to be at a disadvantage as a politician.
Absolutely. More questions. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. British political commentators have noted that some of the key differences between the main parties are now shown on cultural issues like immigration and economic ones like public spending. Is that something borne out in your sort of attitudes of the British public or not, out of interest?
It's one for you, I think.
Yes, so it was alluded to in the other presentations, but basically on BSA, we look at, we use a couple of scales. So there's a libertarian authoritarian scale, which is what we call, which is basically looking at social liberals versus social conservatives, and as well as a left-right scale as well. So as part of the health check chapter, I didn't present on this today, but you can find the full details in the report. I mean, though the libertarian authoritarian divide is an incredibly important one in terms of the nature of political support. You know, authoritarians are heading towards reform and the conservatives, whereas the social liberals are, you know, on the side of the Labour, Lib Dems and the Greens. So that divide is an incredibly important one, and the way that scale is constructed is it touches on those culture war issues that you mentioned in the question. So yeah, it's an incredibly important dividing line for the parties.
Can I then pick this up, because it also gives me a chance to respond to one of our Annalisa's points, which was about how does Brexit really matter? So one thing, so crucial point to understand is that if we go back 20 years, while there's a bit of that social liberal, social conservative divide being reflected in our politics, particularly actually in support for Liberal Democrats, the secret's in the name, right? And the Conservatives always tend to be somewhat more popular social conservative. Actually, for Labour, whether you were a social liberal or social conservative, it made no difference, right? It was utterly irrelevant. So our politics 20 years ago was primarily an argument between left and right, which is essentially an argument between those who think that the state should be doing more to try to reduce inequality and those who think the state should be trying to create incentives for entrepreneurs to invest, thereby grow the size of the economy from which we all benefit. And that's kind of a classic left-right argument. What has happened during the course of the last decade, it's not unique to this country, but in this country, it's the Brexit referendum that's particularly pushed it forward into prominence in our politics and politicized the issue, is that our politics now is two-dimensional. It's no longer just about left versus right. It's also about being social liberal versus social conservative. Why has Brexit mattered this? Well, actually, if you go back to, again, it's one of those things where British social attitudes tells you things that you need to know, but perhaps you never realized. If you actually look at how people voted in 2016, it was more or less utterly unrelated to whether or not people were on the left or on the right. Okay, Brexit was not a left-right issue. We were not arguing about the size of the state or about inequality. We were arguing about immigration and about sovereignty. And the thing that divided people was whether they were a social liberal or social conservative. The social liberals, who tend to be relaxed about immigration, less concerned about sovereignty, voted for Remain, and the social conservatives voted for leave. And then because the Brexit divide became central to how people voted in 2017 and 2019. This then ensured that that social liberal, social conservative divide became so much more important in 2019. And in particular, the foundation of the Conservative success in 2019 was basically getting about 80% of people who believed in Brexit and who were overwhelmingly socially conservative vote for the Conservatives. Now, the crucial point to understand is that the legacy of Brexit, at least, which is, i.e. the politicization of that broader set of cultural issues, that legacy is still with us. So it's not unreasonable to argue that this isn't just about Brexit. It isn't just about Brexit, although it's partly about Brexit. It is about a wider range of issues which have now become central to our politics. And that what you then discover is that therefore the Labour Party is still essentially very heavily dependent on people who vote Remain, and unlike 20 years ago, are much more dependent on social liberals than they are social conservatives. And that's the character of Labour's vote, and it's something that Labour is still not entirely accommodate itself to. But of course, what is also true is that the Greens are, they're defined by being on the left, Green supporters, but they're very much defined by being social liberals. And you can see them nibbling away at the Labour vote, particularly amongst younger people. But equally, reform above all, they're partly more right-wing, and they're certainly more right-wing than UKIP supporters were. But UKIP reform are very, very much focused at the socially conservative end of the spectrum. And actually what you see now, and when we went back into the field in last spring, you can see this very, very clearly. Reform, as they have risen, have become more and more a vote of older people, people in favour of Brexit, people who are socially conservative. And essentially what Reform have done in the last 12 months is they have taken, well, they already started last year, the Johnsonian coalition that of socially conservative pro-Brexit voters that took the Conservatives to power in 2019 has gone completely over to Reform. Reform are overwhelmingly a pro-Brexit vote. So if you think that Brexit doesn't matter and doesn't signify something, you are again missing something absolutely central to understanding where we are politically at the moment in this country.
Thank you so much, John. And also for the NatSen comms team, for next year, we need a banner that says the BSA telling you what you need to know, but you didn't realise. That's a fantastic
And which
pointer.
politicians may not always want to know.
Well, that too. So we'll take your question in a second, but we've got a gentleman here who had his hand up earlier with the dark blue shirt. Yeah.
So I'm one of the, I can't remember what percentage it was, people who mainly get their news about politics from social media. But I would argue that the mixture of journalists and things like that I follow is different to my friend who's a builder and listens to Joe Rogan for 6 hours every day. So is there anything in the BSA or other work that you've done about that sort of fragmentation and fracturing of the different sort of sources that go into those categories? I'm particularly thinking about things like the sort of gradual fracturing of the kind of shared reality that that in theory is necessary for democratic politics to work, but which increasingly seems to be quite under threat.
Marta?
Thank you for this question, because it speaks to a frustration that I had while writing this chapter, because unfortunately the data that we have can't allow us to go into these details. So I'm looping back to what we said before. I think this chapter, the chapter about politics and social media, raises a lot of questions that it would be very interesting to try to find an answer to, but yeah, it would mean a different survey, new question, new funders. So yeah, unfortunately, our data can't delve into that. But
if you want the
as
answer
you
to
say,
that question, watch this space
yeah.
and please give us some funding. I'll go to you in a second. There's a lady in the aisle with a khaki shirt who I think is next.
Thank you for the presentation. It's all fascinating. My questions are also about social media. I was wondering, in the BSA, is there a question about the breakdown of different platforms, especially considering that in the 24 election, we can see that there was quite an influential presence of Nigel Farage on TikTok. And I was just wondering if there is a difference in the trends we see with the polarizing effects on Green voters and Reform voters according to different platforms. And the second question is more of a reflection on what we see as people perceiving social media as not really a reliable source of information, and how could we interpret that question? I was just thinking about the research on mis and disinformation, and a lot of it was actually focused on the fact and how emotions really is the primary driver of people's consumption of information. And especially in last year's elections across the world, we can see a lot of AI-generated memes. People see them and they know it's fake, but they still share it because that agrees with their sentiments and their views on politics. So despite knowing that the information is fake, there's still a possibility that people would like to share these and have a love with their friends because they think it's something that they personally endorse. So I wonder what that means when we look at the data on reliability, and how should we consider that in the context of mis and disinformation about politics. Thank you.
Thank you. So on the first question, a very, very quick answer, and it's the same I gave before. Unfortunately, our data can't allow us to break by platform. So for that, we need to look at other surveys, or we need to run another BSA. On the reliability question, I think it also goes back to a point that Annalise made before about politically biased material and disinformation. And I think it is important to think about, given we see at the moment there is a generational gap. So obviously, or as expected, those who rely mainly on social media are younger. And so there will be a shift, a natural generation shift in the future. And so our data seems to say that in the future, social media will be the media via which Britain will gain information about politics. So I guess a point is about how to develop critical thinking and how to make sure that the population is able to tell what is biased, what is wrong, what is not truthful information, what is truthful information. So how to use the various tools, and this is an open question for the curricula at school. So what is that we teach at school, and how do we bring up the future generation of voters and of UK citizens? On the emotion, and can you repeat the point about emotion? Because, please. Did you make a point about emotion that I missed?
It's about how people will repeat information they know to be false because they're emotionally true.
That's right. Yeah. Even if they see the information as unreliable, they still share it because they share the sentiment.
Okay. On that, yeah, it's an interesting question, and probably there are surveys where we also track their behaviors online would be also interesting, and then have in the moment question where you ask them, okay, you received this post or this WhatsApp, or you were tagged on this, you saw this reel, why did you decide to share it? And how did you assess it, and why did you decide to do that? These are all very interesting questions, and I think it would be where research on these topics should go and shed light on these.
Can I just come in a bit on this? I mean, I think it's important to understand what we were doing in this chapter. So, sure, there are all these arguments about virtual bubbles and do people trust what they really on social media, and do they get disinformation? Some of which we could get some traction on, but we particularly could not get traction on the question of are people sharing misinformation? But in a sense, what we were doing is saying, well, look, there are all these arguments about the impact of social media, and that ultimately what people say as a result of this is that people who social media polarizes, i.e. we get more people at the extreme left and more people at the extreme right, more extreme social conservatives, more extreme social liberals, and that we get lower levels of trust. So we were looking to say, well, okay, look, if all these arguments about the impact of social media are true, what we should be able to see in our society amongst those who actually rely on social media, we should be able to see these consequences in aggregate. And the point is that while we uncover some, particularly around social conservatives versus social liberals, when it comes to whether or not people are on the left or on the right, there's no sign of any extremism. When we look at their attitudes towards welfare, again, which we've got lots of questions, we don't find any difference. So therefore, it's not clear that the supposed aggregate level consequences are evident amongst those people who are primarily on that medium. So that's what we were trying to do. The second thing I would do is I would just leave you with this thought. Do you think that President Trump's statement yesterday or the day before about the consequences of the US bombing of Iran on Iran's nuclear facility, do you think that's truth or misinformation? But it's been widely reported by the mainstream media.
Thank you, John. That's definitely pause for thought. Matthew, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, first of all, to pitch my case for what do I think getting your news from social media means, it is actually very similar to it, but essentially, I mean, what I'm going to describe is how I do. Like, it's a gateway to actual news. So if I see a thing has happened on the TV, the first thing I will do is I'll go to the BBC website. or The Guardian or The Telegraph or The New York Times or Sky News. So that is where I go, in my view, for my news, because they are producers of news, because my broad contention is people are not good at validating or filtering information compared to what you hope are trained journalists. And even then you need to know you're reading it through a filter. Like, you know, if I put the Telegraph and the Guardian up and I look at the same story in those two papers, you see why you have a reliability issue. But what I will often do is, you know, I use social media for engagement purposes, which is to market it stuff and to talk to people. When I see a thing happening on social media, which I do a lot, you know, I will follow that. But the point is I try to distinguish in my head between, okay, now I'm going to click on this tweet or whatever we call them now on X to go to the BBC and information that is in there. Because I was trained as an intelligence analyst, and before that I was interested in history. And so my first question is, what is the sourcing of this thing, this statement? You know, this is a bunch of words that some person, who is that person? Do they know anything about this topic? And what is striking is the amount to which that validation doesn't take place. And you'd think that's fairly obvious, but it clearly isn't to some people. I think you should treat Twitter or Facebook. I mean, God knows who gets their news from Facebook. Who does that? Facebook is where Facebook is where the reason I'm on Facebook is so I can pretend that I'm interested in what my extended family and friends are doing without having to talk to them. Right? Like, oh yes, I saw that you had a birthday party and little what's her name has, you know, graduated. Well done. Like, you know, that's what Facebook's for. But like,
Matthew, you're revealing your age.
Yeah, this is it. Well, the point is I can remember when my friend who was at university was telling me about this thing called Facebook. But of course, at the start, you could only get on Facebook if you had a .ac.uk email address. Now that is aging me. So the bit where this becomes a security issue is, of course, there is a lot of stuff that is news that is on social media. In the volume of stuff that is posted there by people taking video and posting it online. Or, for example, there's the famous example of the doctor in Abbottabad who was tweeting about helicopters in my village at 2 a.m. What's going on there? And that was the Osama bin Laden raid. This weekend, we had a guy who was like, I just had a bunch of B-2 bombers go over my house. And it turns out that was the actual strike package rather than the ones that were the decoys heading the other way with their transponders on. But the point is you've got to validate and look at this stuff. We are now at the point, though, we are well past this point, where photo reel and video reel gibberish, nonsense, stuff that is not a fact can be created and posted online. We've started seeing this with the use of videos that people not always intentionally post that is not from the conflict that they are posting. So the past 18 months has seen a load of videos of civilian casualties being posted, and people who do validate information can tell you that's from Syria and it's 5 years ago and it's Assad. There's quite a lot of stuff that's from video game cutscenes that turns up online, and people go, look, this thing is happening. No, it's from a video game. What are you talking about? But we are at the point where if you've watched any of those really weird AI generated videos where people do Deep South trailers for Lord of the Rings, which are tremendously entertaining, like, and they're still a little bit uncanny valley, but people have put out Donald Trump saying funny things, Vladimir Putin saying funny things. Well, at the point at which people get their news from Twitter and don't validate their sources and don't ask, is this real? Is this credible? Is the point at which we've got a real problem, because then you can weaponize the spread of social media with the lack of validation, with the ability to now really inject stuff that is actually quite harmful and dangerous. And people should be thinking, this is just like down the pub. If I'm in a conversation down the pub and my mate says, well, I heard, right, you wouldn't immediately be like, oh, well, that's obviously true. But we do now increasingly, because you can see it with your own eyes.
But that in a sense is the point about social media. It's not necessarily that it means that we're engaging in discourse that never happened. It's just that now that you can see it, even though you don't go to the pub.
And this does put the onus on, like, proper media, the legacy media, as people who are far freer with the facts would say, have got to be really good at their validation. And you can see the virtue in things like BBC Verify. But if I'm honest, they've not done a stellar job when compared to, say, Bellingcat over the past year.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you also for pointing out the link between our social media module and national security as well, which is absolutely there. We are running short on time, so I'm going to try and take a couple of questions together if we can get mics to people. There's a lady in the floral shirt at the front. Are there any more hands? There's a lady at the back in a white top, a lady up here, and a gentleman there. If we can get those 4 questions, and then we'll do our best to answer them.
Hi, yeah, my name is Kathy Greenwood from the University of Sussex. I just wondered if you'd got any perspectives on what's driving the increase in dissatisfaction with the NHS since 2020 and how that might relate to any of the demographics and, you know, where people are getting their media from, anything like that, so that we've got more of a hint about what we should be doing.
Thank you.
Heather Roll from British Future. I have a question for you, John. In your presentation, you showed public attitudes to new housing development in their local area. And you showed that since, I think, 2020 to 2021, the attitudes have become more negative. And you said that was because of COVID, people working from home. I mean, that's a very logical, nice, neat explanation. But I wonder whether that is actually kind of evidenced or whether that's an inference from the data, because it also occurred to me that since that time, there has been much more building in people's local areas, quite substantial building. And I wonder whether that could be. So if you could say really whether that is based on the data or whether you're inferring from the data.
The young lady here.
So thank you. And all the panelists spoke really well to each other and really highlighted what takes on priority. And I'll link this to the military spending question. And so there's a lot of issues I wanted to ask, but I was thinking about climate change and what takes on priority, because there were a lot of research on how climate change was seen as a threat. And today we're not really talking about it because the military space has taken over proximity. And in the case of the UK, can we say that that proximity of the threat, so US is UK's ally, and we see now today that US is now choosing military force over diplomacy, and that affects UK. That affects soldiers in the UK and UK's prospects in even entering a war. So can we say that maybe that's the reason why people are seeing the US as a threat in this country?
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in the grey jacket.
Thank you very much. Hi, Rishi Madlani, and also continuing on the climate aspect of this, I welcome the first time asking a question on green infrastructure. And I was struck but not surprised that people like onshore wind, but not the pylons to connect them to the grid. Given the sort of increasing weaponization of this as a topic, do you have more splits per party per date? I think some stuff has been published from other places around reform voters not being actually anti-net zero, and we're be careful not to extrapolate too much, but also how we embed this across multiple policy areas, because climate is not just about energy, but across how the homes, the transport policy, health, everything. So interested in how you're going to plan to grow that.
Thank you very much. Okay, John, how about starting off with the question about what's driving dissatisfaction?
I can probably answer most of these, actually.
I'm sure you can.
Sure. Well, I'll see if my colleagues pick some of these points up. The answer to the question, the NHS, it's waiting times. That was the data we quoted is data that's part of a much bigger module funded by the King's Fund and the Nuffield Foundation and Nuffield Trust, sorry. And you can use that data to start to work out what are the things that are correlated with dissatisfaction. It was waiting times in the 1990s, and it's waiting times now. Waiting times in the NHS across the UK are way, way above what they ever previously have been. Oh yes, good Lord, yes. I mean, they're up. This was the problem in the 1990s, and this is the problem now, right? And it's just begun to come down. I mean, it's essentially a consequence of the pandemic and the decision we made in this country to basically drop large elements of elective surgery during the pandemic. We're struggling to recover because NHS productivity is still lower than it was before the pandemic. Right? West Streeting has got a real headache on his hand, as indeed do the relevant ministers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. On housing, it's inference, okay? That's just our best understanding interpretation of the data, but I'm quite happy to accept there may also be other interpretations. Do you want to pick up the point about climate change? Because there is a lot more in the on the survey that we've not covered.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of priorities on climate change, sorry, what was the original question? Climate change and what takes on priority, and if climate change is still a priority. I'm not entirely sure about the actual trend in the data on top priorities. As Jan has highlighted, defence has increased, and the consistent top priority for government spending, or what government should be focusing on, is health overwhelmingly. For the reasons identified in John's chapter, and for the troubles that the NHS has been having recently. In terms of broader questions on climate change, I'm not entirely sure.
There were more questions on the 2024 survey than we've been able to delve into here. So watch this space. Basically, at some point we will undoubtedly write them up. And we're also planning to look at the issue again from a somewhat different angle on the 2025 survey. So broadly speaking, what I can say to you is that certainly for the last 2 or 3 years, we've taken the decision that climate change is a perennially important issue. It's one where arguably BSA has not covered it as much as it should have done in the past, but that we are now committed to try and keep on being able to track public attitudes as they evolve over time.
And will we be able to the last question, be able to track political parties' views on climate change and maybe views on other issues?
Having looked at the data, I can tell you that there are some interesting data about the relationship between political parties and net zero. I mean, we know more broadly from the data in this area that while there's broadly speaking a public consensus about net zero, there isn't agreement about how you deal with it. All right, and that more generally, public opinion basically says, could government please change the regulation of the market so that I can carry on with my lifestyle without being affected? In other words, they want to be able to carry on doing what they do, but they want industry to be regulated so that it isn't producing the nasty carbon that's causing all these storms. The difficult area, of course, is the fact that 2 of the big changes, heat pumps and electric cars, involve people involving in capital investment. And that's why these 2 issues are arguably the difficult ones. And of course, there's the interesting thing today that the Committee on Climate Change is saying we should reduce the price of electricity in this country and start to reflect the fact that we're arguably overcharging for it, so that the incentive to switch to electricity and away from fossil fuels is rather greater. And I suspect we'll be hearing more about this in future.
Thank you very much, John. Now, the time has come to close. So I'd just like to say a quick thank you to all of our panelists and respondents for their wonderful contributions today. Thank you very much. I think my main takeaway from today is that this data really, really matters. There are some things that you think, okay, yeah, it's unsurprising that more younger people are getting their news from social media, and then you look into the actual chapter and you realize there's a lot more there. And so I would encourage all of you to have a look at all 4 chapters, which are available online at the NatSem website, and they'll be put up today. As John says, there is a lot more in the 2024 data, and hopefully we'll be able to publish more on that within the coming year. But also, we're not a one and done at the British Social Attitudes Survey. This is conducted every single year, and you've given us some great food for thought on how we can develop some of our questions for next year. And if there are any people here or online, as we've said before, who would be interested in funding that work, please do get in touch. Now, thank you very much, everybody. There's refreshments outside.